We will be discussing nutrition behaviour and how to encourage positive behaviour change and maintenance of good habits in your players. For this talk, I'm going to take learnings from the research on common challenges and scenarios often encountered in high performance sport, but also from my own experiences in working with athletes in both individual and team sports, as well as the experiences of my colleagues that they've shared with me. As mentioned, happy to take questions throughout or even hear of your own experiences or something you may have tried that may have worked with positive or encouraging positive behaviour changes throughout the presentation, but there should also be time for some questions at the end. In terms of what we're going to be covered, we'll discuss what's going to be considered best nutrition practice in terms of nutrition and how that is reflected in someone's behaviour. On the flip side, we'll talk about what the undesirable nutrition behaviours are and how to spot them. I'll talk through the barriers and enablers of adhering to good nutrition practice in terms of what's been reported by athletes themselves from other sports, as well as GAA, and also what's observed as barriers and enablers from the perspective of a sports dietitian and nutritionist. And finally, we'll finish up with some of those strategies to support and encourage positive behaviour change, help reduce those barriers, help problem solve challenges, and help keep players on track. So to start with, what is best nutrition practice? Sometimes these can be hard to spot or observe unless you're kind of actively asking about it or talking to your players about it. So here are just some things to maybe look and listen out for if you're talking to an athlete. For me as a practitioner, a big one is having a consistent meal pattern and eating at regular intervals throughout the day. A consistent meal pattern will probably help minimize the majority of issues that you sometimes see with players, particularly around arriving to training low on fuel or not being able to recover properly. So if you know, hearing from players or overhearing that they love their breakfast or they can't wait to have dinner after training, then these are good signs. And this also ties in well with starting training well fueled. They might be having, you know, their 3 main meals a day, but if that lunch, that pre-training meal was 5 to 6 hours ago and they haven't had anything before training, it's quite a long time, so probably not starting well fueled. So you want to hear them say that, you know, they're having lunch about 2 to 4 hours before training, or some food 2 to 4 hours before training, and maybe some top-up snacks. If they haven't been able to have that top-up snack, they might at least be arriving with, say, an isotonic sports drink, some jellies, a cereal bar, some rice cakes, so that they can at least have those as they're getting changed, and so that you can have some confidence that they're at least starting that session with some fuel on board. Excuse me. Likewise, with nutrition recovery, we want players eating within an hour as well. So depending on what sort of services you're providing to your teams, if no food's provided, are the players bringing their own snacks to eat or recovery product to drink after training, especially if they might have to travel some distance to get home. Alternatively, as food is provided, are they eating what's available to them? We know that being well hydrated is beneficial for health and performance, and this can be an easy one to look out for because you just simply need to see if they're bringing a drink bottle with them. But not only that, is that drink bottle actually making it to the pitch and it's not just sitting in their kit bag or in the changing room? And do you actually observe them drinking from it in the lead up to training or the game, during and after as well? From an anti-doping perspective, we want to make sure that they're using batch-tested supplements. So if they're talking to you about that, are the brands familiar to you, such as Kinetica or Science and Sport? These are brands that batch test all of their products. My Protein and Optimum Nutrition only batch test a select portion of their product, and it's often from their elite range. And although strict liability is obviously about the individual athlete, this is an area where best practice can actually be supported by the county, whether it's providing batch tested supplements if it's in your budget, or having athletes declaring what supplements or medications that they're using on a register of sorts, which could then be checked. So the final 2 points there on sort of good sleep and health, they might not solely be affected by good nutrition, but they definitely have a relationship with it. Getting good sleep is important as it supports the player's recovery and also their ability to use the different nutrients to either build muscle, reduce muscle damage, or help refill the tank for that next training session. While consistent good health or ability to brush off colds or recover from illnesses easily are indicators of a regular meal pattern and also of a quality diet that's varied and high in different food groups, including fruits and vegetables. Just any questions on sort of that area?
Julia, it's Ryan here. I have a question here from Eugene. I'll go ahead and read it out. Would you encourage players to write the food and water intake into a diary or journal? Track sleep patterns in the journal as well?
I would encourage athletes to do that on occasion in terms of tracking their food intake. After you ask them to do it all the time for a long period of time, they won't do it, they'll lose compliance, but it is good as a kind of a check-in to see if what they are doing is right and maybe get an idea of, oh, I have got big gaps between my meals, or I'm eating at a regular time before training. So definitely on occasion and maybe throughout the season, it can be good. I think tracking sleep is something that can be done definitely daily for a longer period of time because it's pretty easy to do.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Moving on to the undesirable nutrition behaviours, which is more or less the opposite of what I just talked about. And these are probably sometimes easier to spot as well. And recognising some of these might help with identifying what part of nutrition practice your players might be having some issues or problems with. I'll also add that when we're talking about undesirable nutrition behaviours, we're talking about them being done over consistently over a period of time and not just sort of one-off random incidences because a player's just had a bad day here as well. So the opposite of a good meal pattern is a poor one, so eating at irregular times or going for long periods, say 4+ hours without eating any foods. And a sign of this could be sort of regular tiredness, even if they say they're getting enough. Poor quality diet.
Sorry, guys. Could everybody just mute their mic, please? Thank you. Sorry, Julia.
All good. I've also got this sort of poor quality diet, maybe in terms of high and consistent intake of foods that are maybe high in calorie and low in nutrients, such as your fast foods, pastries and fries, or alcohol intake, which doesn't provide a lot of other nutrients. I didn't state, you might have been wondering, under best practice nutrition about always having a good quality diet on what sometimes might be described as a clean diet. Just on a side note, don't like using the word clean, but that's because some athletes have such high energy demands that they're not always going to be able to meet them just by having, your fruit, your veg, your good meats, chicken, and bread, and that they will need those high calorie foods from time to time. But we just want to make sure that that's not making up the majority of their diet, that they're still having the fruit and veg alongside that as well. A poor food pattern and also the low quality diet may not only present as regular tiredness, but also not adapting to the training load. So they might not be getting worse, but they're not getting fitter or any faster or stronger as you expected. Poor pre-training fueling. So this could be detected if you've noticed that the player is really lethargic during the session, or if they're fatiguing quite early compared to normal. Poor concentration, skill execution, and decision making are other indicators of inadequate pre-training fueling as well. And another one from my experience is also a high consumption of energy drinks. If they're drinking Red Bull or Monster consistently to pick themselves up, then I'd be asking further questions about what they've eaten that day, as they're probably relying on the caffeine to act as a band-aid for poor fueling and nutrition. In terms of recovery, are you observing if they're bringing foods with them or not, or if they're not eating or drinking after the sessions? Do they not take any of the food that's available to them? Have they got maybe high muscle soreness or more muscle soreness than they would report in the past, or it's taking them longer to recover? Or maybe they might be starting off the week really good, but by the end of the week, their performance is fading out. Spotting poor hydration is as simple as spotting good hydration. So if they're not bringing a drink bottle with them to training, or if they're not taking any fluids on board during the session. In terms of anti-doping, if you've heard players saying that they've, just bought some new supplements just off the shelf from a shop that they've walked into, or from an Instagram ad, or they're using a product that's claiming it's fat burning or muscle building, an all-in-one pre-workout, those are quite big red flags from an anti-doping perspective for risk of contamination. And finally, sometimes poor nutrition habits develop not just because of poor practice, but when people become extremely focused on food. So if it's all they talk about, if they've become really strict and they seem agitated if they have to sort of deviate from a plan, or they might be sort of cutting out whole food groups, then they may be developing what we call maladaptive behaviours, such as restricted eating or disordered eating practices, which can occur in male athletes. Finally, similar to good nutrition, players with continued poor nutrition behaviours may present with more frequent illnesses, they may be more injury prone, and also complain about poor sleep as well. And I've got asterisks next to these because these factors are multifactorial. Poor sleep could be caused because they've got a bad bed, or prolonged stress and poor menstrual health, such as anxiety and depression, may also lead to illness, poor sleep, and nutrition as well. Any questions?
Julia, there are a few questions here. There's one there from Garrett Coyle. Would you recommend that players weigh in, weigh out pre and post training?
So it depends what you're using it for. So you can use it to help dictate or provide support in terms of rehydration practice. So if you're weighing in before and after, and say they've lost 500 grams, then we know they have to at least replace that and then some. So they need to drink like 1.5 liters, ideally, if they've got the time, if the training session's not finishing too late. So in that instance, yes, it can be worthwhile to do that and try to establish maybe good behaviours around hydration.
Okay, thank you. Julia, I'll just, we have another question here from Sean McCreesh. I'll maybe just for to encourage interaction, I'll ask Sean maybe to unmute and ask it himself, if that's all right, Sean.
Yeah, no problem, Ryan.
Go ahead there, Sean.
No, it's just it's regarding creatine at the minute.
Yeah.
It's probably within my own club and probably younger players who I'm talking to. It seems to be the main one on social media, and with younger ones having access to social media, they're probably seeing all these influencers and all this sort of stuff happening. And I'm just very conscious of the age group that I work with is probably about 14 to 17s.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give, probably from coaches' point of view, to talking to them about it, or is it okay to take? Maybe, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with it, to be honest.
Yeah. So for that age group, I'd definitely be trying to dissuade them from using it, saying that they'll get better increases in performance or better gains by having solid nutrition and solid training. I know it's not a sexy message to try and sell, but I think just sort of saying that, they'll be able to see better improvements through food with creatine, it is actually one of the supplements that does have a lot of evidence to help support training and performances in adults. So in athletes that have finished maturation, have finished sort of growing, and also when they've got those good patterns of training and good nutrition to support it as well.
Thank you.
Can I come in there as well, Julia?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Sean, I suppose one of my roles in Ulster GAA is I'm the anti-doping tutor, and I deliver the education to the county senior squads. And one of the worrying trends is just what you're talking about there. You know, the supplements being marketed towards the young players, and it's quite a scary development, because the anti-doping, or the whole area of supplements, it's not really a regulated industry, or it's not regulated as much as it should be. And quite often young players can just go to a shop or buy online something that contains a performance enhancing drug, or something that contains an ingredient that's just not good for them. Okay, so I have put it in the chat there that there's some good resources at learning.gaa.ie /anti-doping. There's actually like an online course you can do there as well. But I'd agree with Julia, for players of that age group, I would say it's a no-no. You know, unless it has been recommended by, you know, somebody, a nutritionist, or a qualified person, I would say that it's an absolute no-no. But one thing I would say, having said all that, is there is a way of checking. There's a website called Informed Sport, where you can check. So say a young player is thinking about buying a supplement, and they can check on Informed Sport if that supplement has been batch tested. And that's just good practice to embed with players who are taking supplements. But at that age group that you're talking about, I'd fully agree with Julia. I think it's a no-no. I'd be encouraging to get everything they need through food, rather than turning to a supplement.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Completely agree with you there. Right, moving on. So changing behaviour is complex, as it involves the interaction of systems embedded within social and physical environments. So we need to understand the challenges or triggers that influence behaviour, some of which act as enablers for some athletes and barriers for others. These barriers and enablers can sort of be classified into three broad areas. So capability: do the players have the knowledge and the physical skills to implement these changes, and good nutrition practice? Having an understanding of what motivates them and their beliefs, and if this motivation is social or performance directed. Because if an athlete doesn't believe nutrition will help their performance, they're going to have very low motivation to change their behavior. Finally, opportunity: to be able to put into practice the guidance or the knowledge that they've been provided. Start with some common barriers, and you may have even come across some of these yourself. So started with high food costs, and this can definitely be a real barrier just due to the sheer volume of food that some players may need to eat. But it could also be a perception that trying to eat well or follow good practice is expensive, or it means having to buy expensive product or organic product. It might also, they think it's a high food cost or high cost because they're spending money on expensive supplements that aren't safe or might have minimal impact on their performance. Limited time availability. There's time pressure from so many different angles, whether it's work, study, family, travel, and also training as well. And then you're trying to fit in the time to eat, let alone maybe organize, plan, and prepare food. Poor food availability relates to a couple of things, such as lack of food access. So there might not be anywhere to store or heat food at work. They might work on site, or they might have limited break times, or they don't believe there's suitable food choices available to them at their place of work or at home. Or they don't like the taste of food, or they perceive that trying something new isn't going to taste good. And I've placed travel sort of under time and poor food availability, as it is often associated, say with travel time, taking away time for food preparation, or if they're on the road, they have limited options to eat. Other barriers that have also been identified as challenges by some athletes to meeting nutrition goals are, for instance, if the nutrition knowledge is low amongst their peers or family, and they may feel pressured to eat those sort of calorie-dense, nutrient-poor foods to fit in, or because that's only what's available in the house or being bought for them. In some instances, team culture can be a barrier, particularly if nutrition isn't considered important, or there's low expectations of them, or the environment is not supportive. A big one that's come out of lockdown is lack of routine. So not having that structure of getting up and leaving work or study to help guide regular meal patterns has definitely had an impact on a lot of athletes that I've worked with and other practitioners I've worked with as well. And your emotions can also impact nutrition adherence, particularly stress, sadness, guilt, or shame. And sometimes these are linked to performance. For instance, if someone's trained poorly, they feel bad about themselves, and because they're sad, they choose foods that are unsuitable to eat. And if this is sort of prolonged or continues to happen, it can lead to guilt or shame around eating the rubbish food or not following the nutrition advice, and they can sort of get stuck in this cycle that they don't know how to break. Any questions about the barriers?
Yes, we have a few. We have Terence McWilliams ask a question here, Julia. I'll ask Terence if he wants to unmute and ask the question here himself directly. Go ahead, Terence. Okay, maybe he's still muted. I'll ask it here, Julia. How many meals per day should players take?
All right. So ideally, you want them to have their at least 3 main meals, so their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then ideally between 2 or 3 additional snacks that will fit in around the training session if they're training, or to try and plug gaps if say they're having breakfast at 7 in the morning and they're not eating lunch till like 1:30, or vice versa if they're having lunch at 1:30 and not eating their dinner to say 6 or 7 o'clock.
Okay. Just Julia, I'll give you a bit of a timeout here. I've just put a question or an invitation into the chat. Any experiences that any of the people on the call have had around the area of barriers that you've come across with the teams that you work with? Just go ahead and unmute if you'd like to share them with us. Don't think we have any takers. Yeah, Eugene has his hand up. Eugene has his hand up. Okay, Eugene, come on ahead.
Yeah, Ryan, one of the things, that I was involved with the dairy squad for a number of years, and we had a nutritionist in and giving great advice on what to eat and what not to eat. And then you drive up the road and you meet a player coming out of the shop with all the wrong things in the basket, and you say to yourself, this is one of the reasons I was thinking of this particular session, how to change behaviour and how to make sure you get buy-in. And Ulia had mentioned there the whole team culture, which Des and that had spoken about a few weeks back. And it's interesting that this is all bought into the same idea of linking it to team culture. And I'm not sure if leadership groups within teams can actually help track and monitor other people that are maybe having issues, because it's not an easy task to change your eating patterns, even though you may see yourself as a high performing athlete. So it's difficult to track and difficult to monitor when you don't have professional players in all of the time with you and you're only seeing them maybe twice a week. So I think this idea of leadership groups in this particular area where they can actually buddy up or they can help one another along the way, I think is maybe one way of trying to tackle it. Just an observation.
Okay, thank you, Eugene. We have another question here, Julia, from Bobby. Bobby, do you want to unmute and go ahead and ask that yourself?
Do you hear me, Ryan? Okay. No, it's not working. No.
No, can hear you, Bobby.
Yes, go
You hear
ahead.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. Julia, do you recommend the likes of apps like MyFitnessPal for recording nutrition in terms of the macros? Because I know the coaches can link into the back end of it and players can put the information onto it. It's just about accountability, really. But would you recommend that type of app for players?
I think it depends on the player. To be honest, like it can be useful. I think with apps like MyFitnessPal, you also need to be cautious about the values that they're given, because there's can be quite a bit of error in them. But it's good for, I suppose, tracking to see if they're maybe having more on a hard training day or less on a lower training day, or a rest day when they might not need to fuel as much, or say for that accountability process, if they know someone else is also going to be kind of looking at it as well. So it can be definitely useful in some instances. I wouldn't say do it all the time, like every day for the whole season. I'd probably pick your moments for it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. We have another question from Frank. Frank, go ahead and unmute there and go ahead with your question.
Lovely, thanks, Ryan. Julia, I'm looking at some advice. I had a senior football team last year. I had a young fella, 18 years of age, who would have been my third choice goalkeeper. A good lad, good ability, but his biggest problem was his agility because he was overweight. How would you, he came to me asking what can he do? How do you interact with someone that young on that area?
That's a really tough one. It's probably one I can't answer too much just in this setting, in this context. I think it's important to just maybe understand what else is happening in that boy's life as well, because that's going to play a huge role in the support that he would have too. I definitely encourage him to stay away from sort of eating nothing or minimal foods, or sort of crash kind of dieting, because it's not sustainable there as well. That's in that sort of scenario, like if you can engage with a nutritionist to provide more of that individual one-on-one support, that would be good. But maybe just as basic would be to try and create a small calorie deficit, is to say, you know, how much veg are you eating at dinner? Maybe try have at least half your plate instead of only a quarter of it. Or none, if that might be what he's having. And then the other half you would have sort of your spuds, or your rice, or your meat, or your chicken. And even just sort of shifting how you portion your plate that way might help to create that small calorie deficit, but also keep them full.
Lovely. Thanks, Julia.
Just a couple, just one, it's more an observation here from Ronan, Julia, and I say this will be the last, and then we'll let you get on with the rest of the presentation. Just an observation, but culture and accountability among players is key here. You can provide the advice, the structure, but you can't be their constant keeper on things like this. Leadership groups help, but personal accountability and willingness to improve is key for success in this area. Yeah, fully agree with that, Ronan.
Great. And then thanks for those questions and those comments. It's really insightful to hear as well.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, listen, Julia, we'll let you get on with.
Great, thanks. So moving on, there's just also some factors that can act as both enablers and barriers, depending on the athlete or the circumstance. So for instance, some players, if they like to cook, then they can cook. Food planning really helps give them that structure or that routine. Well, if they don't have that capability, then they might not have the confidence to manage different scenarios or regulate what it is that they're having, again, leading to some demotivation. For some, being an athlete might be what increases their confidence and motivates them to follow practice, because it's what's expected of them. but it might also lead to pressure to sort of be perfect. It kind of ties into double-edged sword that is the world of social media. You know, someone said having good leaders, or it might be motivating to see other athletes or other players that they admire also exhibiting those good nutrition behaviors and seeing that on social media. But it can also lead to massive amounts of misinformation and also unrealistic expectations, particularly around body composition, which may then lead to stress and guilt and shame and that sort of cycle as well. Performance is often described as a carrot and a stick. Sometimes when athletes know they have to perform, they'll do everything right, or it's easier to stick to the routine and be disciplined when they're training well and they're feeling good. But if that stimulus is taken away, if they've become injured, or they've been training poorly, or sometimes they might just feel the pressure to be perfect all the time, and that's not sustainable. Another one for players, some of them being with regards to body composition, whether it's regular assessments or comments or remarks on their body shape. They can either be negative or positive. Assessments can be viewed as being a way of providing constructive feedback for some players, while if an athlete might be performing well, but the only feedback they're receiving or that they're hearing is about their appearance, that might demotivate them, because, you know, what's the point in recovering properly or training properly if all they look at is what I look like is all they see. And this could also be an issue because judging performance by how someone looks can reinforce poor dietary practices that may lead to those sort of maladaptive behaviors and start relating to sort of food obsession and sort of eating, as well as poor health and links to injury risk. So if you're saying maybe you're looking good because you're performing well, maybe just expand on that sentence to include those performance aspects, such as you're running a lot faster now, or you're a lot quicker, or you're a lot better. And likewise, if you're needing to provide negative feedback to them as well, constructive feedback, sorry. If your team has a nutrition practitioner, or if you're looking to engage with one, these are sort of some common enablers or and barriers to athlete adherence that were identified by us, by nutritionists and dietitians. So one of them would be the lack of organisation skills required for food planning and preparation to follow nutrition plans or advice, or the athlete might have the skills and the capability, but because some programs are, you know, they're athlete-centered, everything might be done for them. And then when they're away from their environment, they don't know how to do it, or they lack the personal responsibilities, so someone should be able to actually do it themselves as they expect it to be done for them. Performance accountability, as mentioned, competitions and matches can heighten motivation to eat. However, with team sports, nutrition doesn't always dictate performance. There's so many other factors and variables. So if an athlete can't see that direct performance outcome, it's hard to get that behavior change as well. So sometimes it might take a poor performance or something that inhibits performance, such as illness or gastro injury, to kind of hook the athlete and sell them on how nutrition may influence it. It's definitely great when staff reinforce the nutrition messages. I've been quite fortunate since I've been living here to work with sort of S&Cs and coaches in particular who do that, and would also kind of stay in their lane and direct nutrition questions to me. However, it is common for members of staff to, you know, sometimes use nutrition to build a relationship with players. We all eat, we've all got our favourite foods, yeah, but sometimes can undermine the nutrition practitioner if that staff member is providing suggestions that contradict the advice that's been given. So in one particular study, S&C coaches and managers were identified as the key personnel around this due to their own experiences from playing days or their own personal bias. Sometimes if you've got chefs or cooks, they might want to keep the players happy, so they might make them their favourite desserts as well. Another factor is around the food service environmental food provision. So sometimes colleagues have reported, they would provide this advice and then they might go to lunch or training would finish and the food options put forward contradict the message that they've been saying. So, there might be sort of crisps and chips available. So if an athlete thinks, well, I can't even eat like that when I'm supposed to be at training, how important can it be? So I suppose it's around a bit of the team culture and environment as well. So a nutritionist not being able to influence that food service environment can act as a barrier for some athletes, while at the other end, having an influence on that food provision to sort of create delicious and nutritious meals or suggestions around those can help to encourage positive behaviour change as well. Any questions and comments on this section?
We have a couple that came in there. Julia, maybe more general questions. Would you like to leave those to the end, or are you happy enough to take them now?
I'll probably leave the more general ones to the end.
Yeah. No, that's fine. There's one from Terence and one from Bobby there, but as I say, I'll remember and I'll we'll invite them in once you finish the presentation.
Brilliant.
Great, thank you.
Right. So, what are the enablers? These are some. So performance, as mentioned before, having matches or competition selection can help keep them on track. Having supportive family and peer group, someone said if your teammates are doing it, if your friends are following good practice, then the individual players are going to more than likely to adopt these as well. Having that positive team culture and environment where good nutrition behaviours are encouraged and maybe required or been accepted. Having the knowledge and skills can give the players confidence to act on the advice provided, implement the necessary changes or adapt required. And one study found that when players were athletes were seen as people first and also having a good relationship with their sports nutritionist also encouraged positive behaviours as well. So if athletes reported if their nutritionist was approachable, treated them as a person first, and then they would be more likely to be honest about what they're eating and when they're eating and take more responsibility. And they're more likely to bring up the challenges they're facing and seek help to overcome them as well. Because part of my job is often, just being a sounding board or helping to problem solve. We can also provide them with reassurances that what they're doing is right. Sometimes they just don't know, or might not be confident if what they're eating all the time and that they're eating is right or not. And we can also just provide reassurance that 1 or 2 days of poor food intake isn't going to set them back, and it kind of takes a little bit of pressure off them as well. So having a nutritionist who's got really good at those soft skills is important and is able to build that relationship and rapport with your players. Right, moving on. So this information is all well and good, but what are some strategies that can help implement and encourage good behaviour right now? So we're wanting to build capability, opportunity, and motivation, and hopefully some of these 4 factors might provide practical ways to do this. So although I've gone through the barriers before, every team is different. So it is important to determine what are the barriers or the challenges that your team faces. If you have a nutritionist, that might be done by them during one-on-one consults, or a survey can be used to find this information out from both the players and staff. And it could be run by anyone sort of in the management or backroom team. I've also got there you might observe some barriers that the athletes themselves might not bring out or mention, so maybe highlighting that to them as well. We want to educate widely, so not just the players, but also backroom staff and support networks as well, so that everyone's sort of singing off the same hymn sheet. It's great when I do a presentation to underage rowers or minor players and see the parents there. It also gives the parents confidence knowing to know if what they're doing is right or not as well. We also want to educate sometimes regularly, so not just a one-off sort of once a year. The message needs to be repeated to be allowed to sink in, or even give the opportunity to allow players to ask questions or pull up other players if they observe poor nutrition behaviour within the team. So even if you can't engage a nutritionist on an ongoing basis, it's still important that the messages are repeated. So if they've done a talk, did they provide some examples of easy fueling foods or recovery ideas? Can you still share these with the team on a regular basis over time? It could be that someone within the panel with a management background or players, make it player-led, send these as reminders into the group chat. Or if you're sending out a weekly schedule, could you include some messages such as it's going to be hot this day, make sure you bring lots of water, or it's going to be a long day on pitch, to make sure that you eat before and bring sessions, before the session, and bring some snacks as well. As touched on before, information is everywhere these days. So we want to make sure that players and their support networks are receiving nutrition information from reputable sources. These are some great accounts to follow on social media. These are their sort of Instagram handles there. And they provide, snippets of education as well as resources. And also sometimes, they'll have a guest athlete on as well, which can create some buy-in. If you're looking at accounts, or if your players are looking at nutrition accounts to follow, you want to avoid the ones that don't list the qualifications. They might always be just promoting supplement products as well, or they've got a high amount of, say, before and after transformation pictures, because that's just too big a focus on body composition, and it's not actually good nutrition practice as well. Here are some websites for information and recipes as well, both in Ireland and abroad. At Sports Institute, we don't currently have this going. We don't unfortunately have the capacity to develop and update these resources as often as we would like, but it is a work in progress there as well. Any questions on those two sections?
Julia, that's the end of the presentation, is it?
No, I've still got a couple more slides.
Still got a couple more. No problem. I'll just give you one, maybe at the minute. Again, it's more a general one. Terence had asked, what, if anything, should you add to water during games?
Yes, so during games, you can add or drink like an isotonic sports drink, because that's going to give the players some fuel as well, in terms of some carbohydrate that's in there. If they're quite good at maybe being able to eat during half time, or just right before they run out to pitch before the game starts, then particularly if it's a hot day, you might want to have an electrolyte tablet. Be aware that there needs to be a batch tested electrolyte tablet as well in there too.
Good stuff, thank you. Listen, Julia, I'll let you finish off. There are a couple more questions, but we'll leave those till after you've got through the presentation.
No problem. Great. Although we're wanting to change behaviours, it's still important to manage expectations around nutrition. The goal is not to be perfect all the time. It's too hard for anyone to keep up. So consistency, not perfection, is my mantra these days, because life happens, off days are going to occur. And again, if players are more aware that this is okay from time to time, then they're more likely then to refocus and get back on track, rather than lose interest altogether or get stuck in that cycle. We also need to make sure that we manage expectations around appropriate time frames to observe maintainable changes in body composition, whether that's increasing or decreasing fat or lean mass for the individual athletes as well. And these expectations obviously important for the players, but also just for the coaches, support staff, and even family members too. Right, creating supportive, I suppose, nutrition environments, both in the physical environment and the team culture and planning as well. So once, we're back to being able to do full days training again, is there time in your schedule not only to eat food, but digest food? Or is there only an hour sort of between the sessions? Maybe instead of eating lunch during an analysis meeting, could they be given sort of 30 minutes to 45 minutes to eat beforehand, and then go into that video session where they might also going to be more likely to concentrate now that they've been fed as well. If you're going to be doing skid-fold assessments or nutrition consults need to be done, is time made available for them in the schedule, or are they being squeezed in as an afterthought? Do the players have prior warning about, how hard the session is going to be, so that they know what to bring with them if they need to bring more water or an electrolyte tablet or some snacks as well? We're wanting to encourage openness and also look for solutions and problem solving. So, for instance, if an athlete's got low cooking ability, we don't want to make them really feel bad. We want them to be supportive. Or if they've got exams, say in May, or big deadlines with work, maybe suggesting doing batch cooking and freezing in advance so they've got food ready to go. Or again, if they're not great on that cooking, using a meal delivery service, that might help them there as well. And good communication between members of staff is definitely important, so that nutrition message is united and the same across the board. So whether the player is talking to the SNC, the coach, the physio, kitman, or another player as well. Looking at the physical environment, if you have the capability, you may wish to provide, those quick snacks such as the gummies, sweets, sports drinks, fruits, cereal bars. And if you do, are they visible and easily accessible? Or if you're trying to encourage more personal responsibility, but still want to be supportive if someone has an off day, do you have a small supply of food that can be provided if the player asks for it? And do they know who to ask in order to get it? If you're not providing food, again, is there resources, quick lists of fueling snacks that can share amongst the team that they can keep in their car or their kit bag there as well? And sometimes using information posters or infographics and placing them maybe strategically around in areas where they might actually take a moment to read, such as around the bathroom and the urinals or the sinks, which reminders on nutrition with nutrition tips to keep drip feeding that information to them. If you're able to provide sort of post-training meals and post-match meals, does it match the nutrition message? Or is it croissants, chips, and sausage rolls that's on offer? If you're not providing food, then again, redirecting them to easy recipes that they might be able to use. Or another one that I haven't listed there is if you're able to, go to a school, use their home ec room and do a wee cooking challenge, again, between the players. Nothing gets players excited or involved more than competition. And you can also develop some capability on the players that may not feel so confident in the kitchen as well. If you're providing supplements, as Ryan said before, it's an unregulated, so you want to make sure that they're from a batch tested brand, and that if that's the case, who's responsible for keeping a record of those supplements and the batch certificates, or if the athletes are making declarations of what they're purchasing, who's responsible for checking those declarations. Are you able to invest £30 in a bullet blender so that they might be able to make their own recovery smoothie in the changing rooms or the facilities? Or is it possible to have a small fridge or a microwave so that they can bring food and then heat it to have it afterwards? So, any other suggestions that people have tried?
Go ahead, guys, just to unmute your mic and go ahead.
No. Just sorry, Ryan.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, just in terms of probably speaking from your own experience here from players' point of view, smoothies, go-to smoothies. What would you throw in after, say, a tough training session on Tuesday night?
Throw in some milk, yogurt, and then the great thing about smoothies is that you can pretty much put anything in them to help have that as my base. Maybe like a quarter cup of oats in there as well to provide carbohydrate to help refuel the tank as well. And then whether that's throwing in banana, throwing in even a bit of, I think Nesquik there, some berries. If you've got players that have high energy needs or trying to meet or increase body mass, you might throw in some peanut butter or Nutella as well. They're really flexible, but I definitely have a base of sort of milk, yogurt, and oats.
Thank you.
Anything else there, guys? Julia, I have a few questions here in the chat. Are you happy to take them now, or?
Hang on, I'll just sum up and then I'll
No problem.
Great. So take-home messages. It's probably easier sometimes to spot signs of poor behaviour than good behaviour. Some of these being, maybe what Eugene said before, what they buy in the shops, or fatigue, frequent illnesses, not bringing a drink bottle, or poor concentration. We wanted to provide capability, opportunity, and motivation to support positive behaviour change. And we need to recognise that for some athletes, factors that are enablers are barriers for others. So we want to identify what the issues are in your team, educate widely and regularly to let that message sink in, manage expectations around outcomes and promote consistency over perfection, and create that culture where they're encouraged to talk about their challenges, encouraged to fuel well and recover well, and have a physical environment that supports the nutrition message, ultimately help support positive change and maintenance of good habits. Here is just some lists, if you'd like to do some further reading, here are just some of the articles that are referenced throughout, and that Stokes paper on the bottom as well also shares some of the questions that they used in the survey and interviews with players as well. That is all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. A lot of information on that. Thank you. Julia, we have some questions in here, but I suppose I'll let you catch your breath just for a second. I suppose maybe my observations, I suppose it's like anything else, guys. It's not just about running a webinar or running a workshop at the start of the year, telling players what they shouldn't be eating, and then that's it, done. It's very much an ongoing thing, and I think if anything, that's what we've taken from Julia's presentation tonight. The other thing is that the slides will be available to yourselves. We'll get those out to you, and the webinar has been recorded as well. So just the last point I want to make just before I move on to the final questions is Eugene's just come in there in the chat, and again he's encouraged you to share this information with your coaches and your management teams within your squads as well. Okay. Julia, there's a few challenging enough questions I think here. We'll go on ahead with them anyway. Maddie has asked one there. Maddie, would you like to unmute and go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for the presentation. Mine is looking at sort of injuries. So, with players now going back onto the pitch, sorry, over the next week or so, the risk of injuries may potentially be high. So, is there anything from a nutritional standpoint that we could do to maybe help speed up the recovery so that they're not spending too much time off the pitch, especially in the early stages, the first 2 or 3 days of when they get injured?
Yeah, kind of depends on the type of injury, but definitely to reduce maybe sort of muscle soreness, like making sure they are recovering well, and they're not going into sessions tired, because they're more likely to to probably get injured if they're not concentrating, or they're tired, or their muscles are already fatigued there too. So from a nutrition perspective, normally we say about a 60-minute window, but maybe wanting to shorten that to 30 minutes just to really make sure that they're getting that food in. For some athletes, we do promote food first, but if they don't have a high intake of fish in their diet, particularly like salmon or fatty fish, then maybe increasing omega-3 through batch tested supplements might be an option for them particular as well. But other than that, it's just having that set regular meal pattern and making sure they're actually eating in enough for the training that they're about to do, because although they might have been running, once they get back on pitch, they're going to be busted. So making sure that they realize that they need to fuel more as well.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Julia. We'll take two more questions. Julia, Bobby has asked, what's the normal or average calorie intake for a male senior intercounty player and the ideal macros?
It really depends on how tall your athlete is, how much they're weighing, sort of what their muscle mass is, and if their goal is sort of to maintain where they are, or if they're needing to maybe increase size a bit or try and lose a bit of size as well. It will vary anywhere from maybe 2,500 to up to 4,500-5,000 calories, depending on the player, and also depending if they have a physical job or not as well. So it's a tough one to give a definitive answer for. In terms of sort of macro percentages, it's sort of not moved away from that, but we tend to focus more on how much are they eating relative to their body mass. So for instance, with protein, you're wanting 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per day per kilogram. With regard to carbohydrate, that will vary depending on how much training they're doing. If it's sort of a rest day, it's about 3-4 grams per gram. A hard, heavy pitch day, probably looking closer to like 5 to 7 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate body mass. And fat intake, they should probably just be getting enough just with the foods that they're eating.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Julia, just maybe something that's tied into this, and it's probably it's a difficult question maybe for you to answer just straight away. Maybe something that we'll leave with you. Frank has asked, are there any nutritional studies in relation to specific positions in team sports? So his examples, Gaelic games, obviously a midfielder will cover a lot more ground than a cornerback. Is there any studies in any sport really that you're aware of that are available? Or is that something we can leave with you?
I'd need to look into that more. I know that there have been some studies done in relation to, I suppose, how much distance a player may cover. But I'm not sure how well that's been broken down into different positions. I know in football, in terms of soccer, they have had a bit of research done. So there's a few studies in like the elite players, such as the English Premier League, that have sort of compared your forwards, your midfielders, and defenders there as well. So it is out there. I just need to hunt it up.
Great. No, that's no problem. Well, you can forward that on to me, and I'll make sure then to pass it on to the group.
Okay. Sounds good.
Great. And the last one, I promise it's the last one. Mickey has asked a question here. How soon will players see the benefits of nutritional changes?
Really depends on the player. Like sometimes I'll have athletes within a couple of weeks be like, oh yeah, like I've started adding that pre-training snack, and like I'm feeling so much better during sessions, and they can sort of notice it straight away. Others, because maybe just because of their physiology or their talent, they've gotten away with maybe poor practice for so long that they don't see it as quickly. So it does depend on the athlete.
Okay. Listen, thanks a million, Julia. We'll wrap it up at that. Listen, there's a lot of stuff coming in the chat here in terms of how informative that has been, and thanking you. So listen, thanks very much again. And if there's any more information that you get through, feel free to send it through to me, and I'll pass it on to the group. So listen, thanks very much again, Julia. And just guys, we'll just wrap it up at that. Thanks very much to you for tuning in. Thanks very much for your interaction there as well. It was excellent. Some great questions came through there tonight. The last thing I just want to remind you, the next session that we have is on the 21st of April, and that's managing data generated from different sources for decision making. Okay, so again, thanks very much to everybody for tuning in tonight, and we'll see you again on the 21st of April. Thank you.